Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations, and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobil Corporation, Essex Chemical, the American General Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line.
Last October 9th, Clare Luce died. In no time at all, she was being referred to as the woman of the century. She had earned that title. Books have been written about her, and more books are being written about her right now. The hour that follows does not seek in any way to be biographical or even comprehensive in noting her achievements. What we will do here is simply present her on 4 or 5 different occasions appearing on Firing Line. Her first appearance was in 1966, as we'll note a little later. Her last 15 years after that. She was scheduled to appear in the spring of 1987, but couldn't for reasons given, and then the Grim Reaper moved in. But a few formal details should be given. She grew up in Connecticut, New York, the daughter of a musician who had abandoned his wife, an ambitious mother who cared mostly for the upbringing of her daughter. She did not attend college, but soon married a wealthy and dissolute young man by whom she had a daughter, Anne. Soon there was a divorce, and she went to the flourishing monthly Vanity Fair, of which in due course she became the managing editor. Those were high and stylish days, notwithstanding the Depression. And then one day she met the formidable Henry R. Luce, editor of Time magazine and already the most influential journalist in America. She married him and continued to write best-selling plays, most notably The Women. They were the most prominent professional married couple in New York City. And soon Clare Luce insisted on working the World War as a journalist. From this came a highly successful book, followed by her run for Congress. She was elected from Fairfield County and became a kind of tourist attraction in the House of Representatives in Washington. She quit to have a hand in the campaign of General Eisenhower for president. He named her ambassador to Italy. There she prospered and was in one poll named the best-known woman in Europe. After a few years, she returned to Washington, and President Eisenhower gave her a fresh appointment as ambassador to Brazil. What happened to that is the subject of one of our excerpts below. When her daughter Anne died as an undergraduate at Stanford University in a motor accident, Clare Luce became briefly a recluse and emerged from it as a Roman Catholic convert. She devoted herself to bringing together a life of the saints and to miscellaneous civic and cultural duties, retiring to Arizona to live with her semi-retired husband until he died. After that, she went to Hawaii for 10 years, returning to Washington to continue service with the President's Foreign Intelligence Board. It was there that she was struck with her final illness. Coincidentally, a tumor of the identical kind that had brought down her dear friend and associate William Casey a few months earlier. We will be attempting in this hour to give the viewer glimpses of an extraordinary woman. It was said of her in the obituary in Time magazine that many powerful men, on conferring with Mrs. Luce, felt that they had been dynamited by an angel cake. It becomes relevant in one of the segments you will be seeing to bear in mind that she was always necessarily, ineffaceably, a very attractive woman, no matter how hard she strove to make the theoretical cultural case for abandoning any distinction between men and women, except those that were necessary for biological reasons. And she was always fervently anti-communist, and especially in the last 30 years, she was prominently and without apology a conservative Republican. Indeed, it was the subject of ideological tendencies within the Republican Party that first brought us together. Our first experience with Clare Luce on Firing Line was in 1966. The Republican Party was still reeling from the great defeat of Barry Goldwater, to which defeat Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York had contributed his studied neglect of the Republican ticket. In those days, the question was, where, if any place, is the Republican Party going? In those days, the answer to that was in part, what is Nelson Rockefeller going to do? I began by asking Mrs. Luce a question about his motives.
Now, what Rockefeller's motives were, I have no idea, but I certainly think that was one of them. I think he sincerely believed that the party had to be purged of a conservative, what he considered obsolete view. I think he was mistaken because the history of the success of all great parties in the United States has been what you call big tent politics, making room for everybody and every point of view. So I think he made a grave error. Now, if by any chance he should be nominated again, and it's not to be discounted, he should be nominated, he will find to his sorrow that the people he purged will be the people that won't vote for him, and they will vote for the Democrats, and his loss would be quite as devastating as Goldwater's.
Yes, I have a feeling that's true. Would you guess that if the Republican Party were to proceed to nominate, say, a Rockefeller, that there would be defections as wholesale as there were defections away from Goldwater?
Same thing, yes.
And irrespective of what part Goldwater himself took in the campaign, that is to say, if Goldwater were to exhort the conservative flock...
They wouldn't pay the slightest attention to him, Bill.
Why did they pay attention to Taft when he exhorted them to vote for Eisenhower?
Well, Eisenhower was in no sense a liberal of the persuasion of Rockefeller. Eisenhower was a great public hero, a sure winner. All the polls show that he was a sure winner. And I'd like to say at this point, if the polls had showed that Goldwater could win, Mr. Rockefeller would have supported him to the last drop of his blood. But he failed to support him because he knew he was partly for good reasons and partly because he thought he was a loser.
By 1967, the Republican Party was picking up steam, and conservatives within the party were increasingly prominent. Early that year, Henry Luce, the titanic journalistic figure, founder of Time, Life, and Fortune magazine, commonly understood as a liberal Republican, died. She went to live in Hawaii, and inevitably her perspectives changed a little. She was never lonely in Hawaii, she used to say, but it is true that her husband dead, fewer people made it a point to visit. It was relevant to break through the normal rules of firing line which shrink from questions of personal kind. Accordingly, the question was put to Henry Luce's widow. In this connection, Mrs. Luce, what is the correct interpretation of Henry Luce, your late husband?
Oh, I wish I knew.
Because there are those who believe that he ushered in an attitude very much hospitable to political liberalism. There are others who always thought him, strange enough, as primarily an establishment figure, a conservative. Now, which of those two is more correct?
Well, I don't think you could put a tag on a character as complex as my husband. Certainly, he was not a conservative. He thought of himself as a liberal Republican. The big thing is that he was the most open-minded man I've ever known in my life. He would listen to any point of view, to any idea, however fantastic or screwball it might have seemed, hoping to find in it not only a germ of truth, but a good article for Time and Life, you know? His was an inquiring mind. He was infinitely curious about his fellow man. Now, in one sense, he was a conservative and a traditionalist, he was a Christian. He was a man of profound religious faith. And I think it was this in his character that, or in his thought, that upset the secular liberal left, who could not believe a man could be a great journalist and a believing Christian at the same time.
Well, Whittaker Chambers once wrote to a friend that he considered that the Catholic Church was the only, quote, truly conservative institution in the world. I wonder what you think he might have meant by that, and would he have changed his mind if he had surveyed the movements, if he had lived to survey the movements of the church since he wrote?
Well, I don't know what he meant. Perhaps what he meant was that the Catholic Church has tried to preserve and has succeeded in preserving for millions of people for 2,000 years a true view of the nature of man himself as a creature who is capable of being a saint and who is most of the time a sinner. I'd almost said hopeless sinner, except that the church gave him the hope of redeeming himself. But the church has always kept a true view of the nature of man and the understanding that evil exists in the world. For example, the massacres at Pinkville. There's so much going on in the press about that, trying to discover whether it was something in the social background or of these young men that led them to commit these atrocities. The fact is that there was evil in their hearts, and this could happen and does happen throughout history. Violence, cruelty, sin have existed in all societies, under all economic systems, and in the presence of all religions. It's a constant. And by reminding us of that, I think Whittaker Chambers felt that the church was the conservative force because it prevented people from seeking in some political system or in economic gimmicks a solution for the problem of evil.
A natural substitute for supernatural
Yes.
data. Well, considering this massacre in Pinkville for a moment, isn't it a little bit more difficult to explain than by the banality of evil? Because even if we grant that, let's say, we will always have 1 out of 100,000 people in America, let's say, who are prepared to be bloody killers, isn't it rather extraordinary that 30 or 40 or 50 of them should land up in the same platoon, the same part of the world? I mean, the mathematical chances against it would seem to be 1 in billions. And isn't it that phenomenon that is causing people to wonder, could it be that the platoon itself, the institution itself, rather than the latent evil in everybody's soul, the Hitler in oneself, as it has been described, is a matter of social concern? It's all very well to say, look, if I kill you, that's an aberration. If you and I join in killing you, that could still be an aberration. But if the whole lot of us all of a sudden conspire to kill you, there's something more than an aberration.
Well, one sees something of the sort in a crowded theater when the cry goes up, fire. And panic and fear will seize 500 people, perhaps not one of whom would slap a child, even in anger. And they will nevertheless, in their panic, trample on babies and knock women out to get out. So crowd behavior, group behavior, is mysteriously different from the behavior of the individual.
Is it an aspect of evil?
It can be an aspect of the seizure of the spirit.
Self-idolatry.
Yes. Now, what this group of men, why one held out,
Is interesting, yeah.
is interesting. Now, in the war, you know, I was a reporter in Europe, and I went into a number of these concentration camps, Nordhausen and Buchenwald, shortly after our troops had liberated them. And one of the most amazing things as our men made reports on these camps was why a group of people all living under the same horrible and dreadful conditions, why a few would emerge as saints. They never treated one another violently. They never reported on one another. They took care of one another. There was a percentage of saints in all those camps. There was also a percentage of monsters. I mean, of the prisoners themselves, who did the most horrible things for a pack of cigarettes. And then there was the great bunch in between who went either way. Odd thing about these percentages was, I think it was Napoleon who said, every army is composed of 1/3 heroes, 1/3 cowards, and 1/3 who will go in either direction, depending on whether a man with real leadership emerges from one of the extreme groups. So this particular platoon of men who did these dreadful things, first there's the mystery of the man who wouldn't and who made it his business to bring them to justice. But then there is this mysterious contagion of evil that seemed, according to what we hear, to have seized all the others. This is the mystery of the human heart. Not to be condoned. There is no way of making it seem all right simply by saying it happens in all wars, as indeed it does. It has profoundly upset Americans because it is not their image of themselves. I mean, their image of their soldiers.
And that's good.
That's good that they're upset. I mean, one read no protests in the communist press about the infinitely greater massacre at Hue. So it's to our credit that we are upset.
To our discredit that it happened at all, to our credit that we should be concerned about,
5 years went by, and Richard Nixon was now President of the United States. A few weeks after the segment excerpted here, President Nixon would fly off to Red China, as we used to call it, to make his peace with Mao Zedong. It wasn't only Mrs. Luce who sought to make the relevant explanations for a change in policy. It was also the governor of California, Ronald Reagan. So popular with the general public had that electrical announcement been that Nixon would go off to China and end once and for all the boycott of that country, that you could see the search for plausible explanations in the political mind. Mrs. Luce began by reminding her viewers of the intensity of the position the Luce publications had under her husband's leadership always taken in their opposition to Mao Zedong. But the segment was introduced nostalgically.
I say today that to seat a regime with this record of gangsterism, regardless of what they said about their good intentions for the future, would make a mockery of the peaceful purposes of the United Nations to which we belong.
That, of course, was 10 years ago, but in 1968, the Republican platform had in it the following sentence: under existing conditions, we cannot favor recognition of Red China or its admission to the United Nations. I'd like to ask Mrs. Luce two questions. One is, have conditions changed since these words were written? And if they have changed, what do you believe that the proper conservative response to this particular initiative ought to be?
You're speaking of the president's policy on mainland China.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there's been an enormous change in the world, the whole world picture. 10 years ago, the United States was still indisputably the most powerful country the world had ever seen. It faced a very monolithic communist world. That is to say, it thought it did. I just happened to be one of the people who, right here in Los Angeles, 7 years ago, said the time would come when we would have to recognize Red China in our own interest because of the split that was developing very rapidly between Soviet Russia and China. And so I think that is now obvious to practically everybody except my conservative friends.
Well, how come the president has never adduced that split as a reason for that particular initiative? Is this the necessary diplomatic obfuscation?
Yes, one can't get up and say, hooray, hooray, our two enemies going at one another's throat.
Is there a trick for knowing when a president is saying what he means and when he's saying something different?
Well, yes, when he says he's going to run again, you can probably rely on him.
I wonder if any of you, Governor, you were I know, awfully emphatic on the subject of Red China. Do you see a changed circumstance that is sufficient to justify the initiative of last summer? And do you understand the reluctance of some conservatives to go along with it, if indeed you do see it?
Well, I understand the reluctance of the conservatives to go along with it, a great many of them. And I'd like to take a minute and explain that, but I think first I'd like to also say, and second, what Luce said about the change. At that time, when the vice president was speaking, or the then vice president was speaking, China was literally a captive nation. It was as tied to Moscow and the Soviet Union as any of the satellite nations. The great changes that have occurred, today we find 140 Russian divisions on the border, the Chinese border. One wonders how adventurous Russia might be tempted to be in Western Europe and in the Middle East if they didn't have to keep that force there. We also have, as Ms. Luce pointed out, a United States that today does not have the vast military power where someday everybody's going to have to push the button.
But everybody, including Mr. Nixon, acknowledges that the announcement came as a bolt out of the blue. Now we make it sound not only plausible, but almost imperative. And the answer is, why didn't all us bright people, with the exception of Mrs. Luce?
I spoke to the president, shortly after his inauguration. And he said, well, what about China? Because I think you know, Bill, that my sort of credentials for being anti-communistic, as far as Chinese go, Russians and China, is that I was one of the sort of charter members in the so-called China lobby. Well, the president said, now that was 3 years ago, yes, we have got to get on with a new policy for China. It was no bolt out of the blue to him.
Well, but there aren't that many people who go to the Oval Room and discuss these matters with Mr. Nixon. As regards everybody else besides you, it was a bolt out of the blue.
Well, practically anything is bolt out of the blue to Americans.
As the most dramatic announcement, quote, in history. You know, this put on a par with the moon landing.
Well,
But the point is, why weren't we coaxed into an analysis that makes what Governor Reagan said to us more plausible? Why didn't, after all, I quoted something from 1968. Why didn't they say 1968, but don't forget there are changing conditions? Why weren't we warned that this was the thing to do? Or is this it?
Well, they didn't, everyone.
The actual motives recognized in Red China involve a series of power plays which gentlemen don't discuss in public. Is this really what
Yes.
is?
I think there are things like that. But also, remember, we keep using the word recognition. There's no sign that we're officially recognizing Red China.
We have not exchanged ambassadors.
But Mrs. Luce could talk on many subjects, and one she was professionally concerned with was, of course, women's rights, in treating which she was learned, eloquent, and witty. Up to a point, she was simply unrelenting, as we will see. What is, I think, of common interest is the extent to which, perhaps unconsciously, but perhaps also not, she made her case engaging in part through the rhetorical and physical body language of a woman. She was capable, in discussing feminism, of extreme analytical severity, and her host was here a victim of this. But perhaps for the first time, he showed his masochistic reserves, because I had a very good time. The scene here is Hawaii. She had been living in Honolulu for 10 years. The segment you will hear now is the only one of the 5 from which we borrow that includes the entire introduction of her made at the program's outset. The Equal Rights Amendment, which for a while appeared to be on the verge of adoption, appears once again to be stalled, suggesting a subliminal resistance to formal equality for women, which surprises not at all Mrs. Clare Booth Luce, who throughout her life has given her time equally to pleading the cause of female equality and demonstrating the fact of female superiority. And to be sure, there are those who believe that the super-sophisticated Mrs. Luce is finally caught out, that she is ambushed by the positivist symbols of success. She is endowed by intelligence and cultural perception to transcend, concerning which no doubt more later. Clare Booth Luce was never a failure, which is different from saying she has never been unhappy. As a young woman, she became very quickly the managing editor of Vanity Fair. After an unsuccessful marriage, she became Mrs. Henry Luce and began writing Broadway plays, mostly successful, one of them so much so that she earned several $1 million from it, which she donated to charity. She acted from time to time as a war correspondent for her husband's magazines before entering Congress as representative from Fairfield County. She was appointed ambassador to Italy by President Eisenhower and subsequently ambassador to Brazil, a post she did not in fact achieve because of the exercise of one of her most seductive faculties, to wit, her occasional inability to curb her tongue. She is currently a member of the President's Advisory Board on International Intelligence, which brings her to Washington from her home in Honolulu once a month. She is always active as a writer, as a thinker, and as a conversationalist. Mrs. Luce has appeared on this program more often, if memory serves, than anyone else, but always the theme up for discussion was something other than women's liberation, which she has most desired to discuss. I'd like to begin by asking her whether she finds implicit condescension in the rhetorical formulations with which men tend to introduce her.
Bill, I thank you for that warm and extraordinarily friendly introduction. You'll be pleased to know that in the entire introduction, which was flattering to say the least, there was only one masculine put-down. This is a high level of achievement for a man introducing a woman. You spoke of her inability on occasions to hold her tongue. Now, had you been speaking of a man who spoke out and made enemies for himself in the process, whether he was speaking out stupidly or rightly, wrongly, you would have said, he is blunt. He makes enemies by what he said. He is overly candid. You might have used many phrases, but the phrase, hold her tongue, is a phrase that men frequently use about children and women.
Sort of comes out of Taming of the Shrew?
No, it comes out of man's desire, highly successful, through the centuries to master women. One of the first things children and women are taught to do is to hold their tongue.
Good.
But anyway, congratulations that there was only one subconscious put down.
Which is less than you're used to?
Oh, infinitely less.
What would be a characteristic introduction of you that would show more traces of male chauvinism?
Well,
Although Mrs. Luce is a woman, kind of thing?
no, the sort of thing that happens to a woman. I remember my maiden speech, my first speech on the floor of the Congress.
Is a man's maiden speech also a maiden speech?
Yes. And when the men get boring, the phrase is that they've made a chambermaid speech because they've emptied the chamber. But when I made my maiden speech on the floor of the House, I worked hard on it. The subject was, as a matter of fact, post-war aviation laws, what they might be after World War II was ended. It was a speech that ultimately had an effect on that legislation. But as I came down from the rostrum, a congressman walked up to me and said, "Mrs. Luce, it's true what they say. You have a very good-looking pair of legs." I said to him, and this was my motto straight through Congress, "It's the other end of me you'd better begin to pay some attention to." But imagine how you would have felt had you, let's call it Brother Jim. If Brother Jim had made his maiden speech on the floor of the Senate, and of course there are no women senators left now, there are none anymore, but if a woman congressman came up to him and said, "Oh, Senator, that suit fits you beautifully around the hips."
Well, if somebody said that to me in the Senate, I should think it would suggest some improvement in the normal quality of Senate dialogue.
Yes, I agree with you there, but at least you asked, that type of thing is very often happens to a woman.
Well, let me ask you this. It is one thing to say that arguments that are in no sense intrinsically feminine ought not to be feminized. It is another thing to reason from that rule on over to the rule that there are not arguments that are characteristically feminine. Now, do I understand you to be protesting against a violation of the first proposition or denying the validity of the second?
You've rather lost me.
Well, it's one thing to say you have beautiful legs when you have just delivered the Areopagitica. It is another thing to say it is always wrong under any circumstances to say that this behavior by this person is typically feminine. Are you saying that there is no such thing as that which is typically feminine?
Oh, yes.
You are saying that?
No, I'm not saying it, but I agree there is.
You agree
Having a
that...
baby is typically feminine.
Well...
Not having a baby.
Now, I'm not talking about biological functions.
Oh.
I'm talking about modes of thought.
No, I don't.
Or modes of
typically
expression.
Feminine. Modes of expression,
Well,
that's not modes of
suppose,
thought.
would you say that any novelist who used in his book, let's say, the phrase quintessentially feminine was primarily male chauvinist, or that he was a poor observer a bad sociologist?
Well, that's what, isn't that the German phrase, ehrliche Weib, the eternally feminine? No, I'd like to get at the heart of a rather interesting question. Do you think it's possible for a man to be a Christian and not a feminist?
And not a what?
And not a feminist. I do not think a man, or a woman either for that matter, that you have no problem with women, but a Christian man has got to be a feminist. Jesus Christ was the first feminist.
I think before you get any more tantalizing, you should define your meaning of feminism.
I will define mine. If you don't accept it, we'll have to reach a definition that we agree on.
No, I can gallantly concede.
A feminist, that's a put down.
You can't use the word gallant.
You can say I concede as you would to another man, but what you're doing is pinning a little rose on you for being so nice at not ticking me off, or even for taking the trouble to agree. I gallantly agree. Why not I agree?
Why couldn't you do that to a man?
Well, I think you'd look like a proper fool if you did. I mean, if you did.
You mean you think it doesn't, you don't look like a proper fool if you do it to a woman, but you do one if you do it to a man?
If you did it to a man, imagine you saying to a man sitting in this chair, I gallantly agree. Why, everybody think you're an idiot.
Well,
so there
a lot
is
of
an
people are
attitude.
Pre-committed on that point of view anyway. But anyway, I didn't want
Bill, to go back to
on
the
definition of
Christian
feminism.
point of view, if you permit me.
Yeah, you were going to define feminism.
Oh, I was going to define feminism. I simply used definition. There's one in the dictionary, which is equal rights and opportunities for women in the legislative and social field. And that's good enough definition for me. Or I think you may find in the dictionary the advancement of women's rights. Now, but I wish to go back to the heart of the question. The Old Testament myth of the Garden of Eden has aroused the ire of women feminists for generations. The legend creates, God creates heaven and earth in this legend. In Genesis, he then creates man. Man shares in the Spirit of God.
Now, man the male or man the synecdoche?
No,
or
man.
the human
God created Adam, the first man. I'm talking about this legend. He then more or less leaves Adam to his own devices, and Adam gets rather bored. And as an afterthought, God creates woman, but he doesn't even create a boom like that. He lets Adam give birth to Eve, thus denying to woman in the first few chapters of the Bible, of the Old Testament, the right to be the first mother. She's not even the first mother. Adam's her mother. And then as the legends goes along, the end of it, the rather cruel and dreadful end, is that Eve bears the burden of having brought sin and death into the world. Adam, in a most ungallant fashion, tries to blame the whole thing on Eve. The woman tempted me. He streaks for the bushes, gets himself in the bushes, hides from God, and then when God hauls him forth, blames it on the woman. Now, there's your typical male chauvinist right from the beginning.
Are you saying there's biblical sanction for male chauvinism, but that it's
Yes.
anti-Christian?
Yeah, I say that there is an Old Testament sanction for the hierarchy which makes God the master of man, man the master of women and his children, and also of nature.
Well, but it seems to me that if you're going to take legendary auspices for current attitudes, you will find 10 animadversions on man for every one on woman.
Well, so you will.
In literature.
Oh,
and in
so you
drama.
will. The Old Testament, which is a very lively legend and has profoundly conditioned human attitudes, and the New Testament, but that the Old Testament teaches the superiority of man. Now, there's no doubt that the old Jews believed this. The point I was about to make is that there is the most extraordinary amount of evidence in the Gospels that Jesus had a most unusual mission to women. If you read the Gospels, you'll be startled by how many of the miracles are performed at the request of women and on women. I love the one of the 12-year-old child, and Jesus takes her hand and says, "Little girl, arise." I think that was a nice feminist phrase, by the way. But he has announced his coming first to a woman, and who says that God has looked on her low estate of his handmaiden and is raising her up. His first miracle is a submission, in a sense, to a woman, because
She ran out of wine.
she ran out of wine for a wedding, an integrated occasion, you see. There were very few occasions of a holy nature where there was any integration in the old Jewish world. The women sat upstairs, they were separated in the synagogue, they were not allowed to speak, and they weren't even required to go to church because the salvation of a woman didn't matter much to them. He performs innumerable miracles for women. And then he announces, which is really marvelous, I think for the first time in the New Testament, "I am the resurrection and the life." He announces to a Sumerian woman who is plainly a harlot. And the New Testament notes that his disciples, seeing him talk to a woman, talk to a Sumerian, talking to a harlot, marveled at him. Now, another gesture towards women, when Mary Magdalene brought the ointment to put on in one version, in one chapter, one gospel, she puts it on his feet, in another she anoints his head. In any case, she anoints his body, as he says, against the hour of his burial. And when Judas protests that he allowed her to touch him and to waste money in this fashion that might be given to the poor for the purchase of the ointment, Jesus says, "What this woman has done for me will be remembered. She will be remembered as long as the gospel is preached to the world." This is what made Judas so angry, was this episode between Jesus and a woman, and he forthwith went out to betray.
Well, now, are you saying that there is a remarkable reversal in the New Testament
Yes.
of the attitudes implicit
Old
in the
Testament,
Old
about
Testament?
women.
She's still got St. Paul to cope with.
Not so much as people think. Because if St. Paul contradicts Jesus, then we really have a problem with St. Paul, don't we? But to finish about Jesus, when he spoke from the cross, it was to a woman. The Gospels report that many women followed him from Galilee to be there and stand at the crucifixions. All his male disciples left him, and only the women stood by. Now, the whole evidence, as you read the New Testament, is that he had some extraordinary mission to women, because otherwise you cannot account for their love and their loyalty and their devotion. You cannot find one word in the New Testament from the mouth of our Lord
Well, now, you know, in
that
the...
is unkind or harsh or critical of women.
It is true.
After that program, there was a long hiatus, and then last year, it was agreed that she would appear again in February, almost exactly 10 years later. But she called 2 weeks before to say that her duties by her stepdaughter, who was dying of cancer, made it impossible to accept any fixed engagement. So we agreed to a brief postponement. But then she became ill. She was alternately reclusive and gregarious in the 6 months that were left. She happily scheduled one day a social dinner in New York for the last day in September with a few old friends, and refused to cancel it, even when it was plain that she would not be permitted to leave her apartment, let alone leave Washington. A fortnight later, on the 9th of October, she died. We go now to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City to the High Mass said in her memory, Cardinal John O'Connor officiating.
So this is why we offer this Mass. We offer it with a great sense of joy in the hope that we are truly celebrating Clare's own resurrection. We offer the Mass in the hope that she may at this moment be facing Almighty God in happiness for all eternity, but we offer it also, if need be, that there be a cessation of any suffering that might be due, and that soon she will be in the arms of Almighty God. If you will join me then, we will begin the Mass.
Your Eminence, I first laid eyes on her in 1948. She was delivering the keynote address to the Republican convention, and she said of Henry Wallace, who was running for president on the progressive ticket, that he was Joe Stalin's Mortimer Snerd. They all rocked with laughter, and the critics, of course, bid her again. I first met her at her quarters on Fifth Avenue. She had telephoned and asked if I could come by to discuss the worsening crisis under President Diem in South Vietnam. I was there at 4, and she opened the door with paintbrushes in one hand. I told her by all means to finish what she was doing before we got down to the problems of Southeast Asia. And so she led me happily to her atelier, but instead of herself painting, she undertook to teach me there and then how to use acrylics, launching me in a mute, inglorious career. 2 months later, there came in the mail at my office a big manuscript pulsating with scorn and indignation over the treatment of President Diem by Washington, with special focus on Diem's sister-in-law, Madame New. She called it "The Ladies Not for Burning." I put the article on the cover of the next issue of National Review and had a startled call from the press editor of Newsweek. He wished to know how it came about that Clare Boothe Luce was writing for National Review. I told him solemnly I could manage a hidden smile since we were speaking by telephone, Tous les beaux esprits se rencontrent, roughly translated, that beautiful spirits seek each other out. The following day, President Diem and his brother, the Dragon Lady's husband, were murdered. The only happy result of that Byzantine mess for me was that I was never again out of touch with Clare Boothe Luce. I think back on her career. Look, you are a young, beautiful woman. Pearl Harbor was only yesterday, and you have spent several months poking about disconsolate Allied fronts in Asia and the Mideast. You have written a long analysis, cruelly objective, about Allied disorder, infinitely embarrassing to the Allies and correspondingly useful to the Axis powers. On the last leg of your journey, a sharp-eyed British customs officer in Trinidad insists on examining your papers. His eyes pass over your journal, he reads in it, snaps it shut, and calls in British security, which packs you off under house arrest. What do? Well, if you're Clare Boothe Luce, you get in touch with the American consulate, and the American consulate gets a message through to your husband, Henry Luce. Mr. Luce calls General Donovan, the head of U.S. intelligence. General Donovan arranges to appoint you retroactively an intelligence official of the United States government. The British agree to let you fly to New York, and there they turn your report over to the British ambassador. He is so shaken by it that he instantly advises Winston Churchill of its contents. Churchill pauses from the war effort to cable back his regards to Clare, who meanwhile has been asked by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to brief them on her analysis, which, suitably bowdlerized, appear in successive issues of Life magazine and are a journalistic sensation. Thus passeth a week in the life of the deceased. The excitement and the glamour, the distinctions and the awards, a range of successes unequaled by any other American woman. But 10 years later, she was writing not about tanks and planes, but about the saints. She began coquettishly by quoting Ambrose Bierce, who had defined a saint as a dead sinner revised and edited. But quickly, Clare Luce's tone of voice altered. She wrote that perspectives are very changed now. Augustine, she said, came into a pagan world turning to Christianity, as we have come into a Christian world turning towards paganism. Stooping a dozen times a day, quietly, Clare Luce was writing now about another saint, St. Helena, picked up and carried the splinters of the cross. St. Helena strewed her path as they strew ours. And when she had gathered them all up, she had the material of a cross of no inconsiderable weight. The little way of the cross is not the way of a little cross. Last Wednesday, in Washington, Clare's doctor confided to the White House that Clare would not live out the week, and that no doubt she would be pleased by a telephone call. The president called that night. Her attendant announced to her who it was who was calling. Clare Boothe Luce shook her head. You see, she would not speak to anyone she could not simultaneously entertain, and she could no longer do this. The call was diplomatically turned aside. The performer knew that she had given her last performance, but at least she had never failed. And then, on Sunday, her tombstone at Mepkin no longer sat over an empty grave. She is there with Harry. Over the grave is a shady tree sculpted above the names, and either side her mother, Anne Clare, and her daughter, Anne Clare, in a grove of oak and cypress and Spanish moss running down to the Cooper River. When Bill Sheed wrote those lines 10 years ago, he quoted Abbot Anthony telling him quietly as he walked away, "She's taking it pretty well this year. She's usually very disturbed by this." Clare Luce, now at Mepkin, finally is no longer disturbed. It is only we who are disturbed, Hank Luce above all, and her friends, disconsolate and sad, so sad without her, yet happy for her, embarked finally, after stooping so many times, to pick up so many splinters on her way to the cross.
Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations, and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobil Corporation, Essex Chemical, the American General Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $3 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. Indicate the subject of the program, and please allow 3 weeks for delivery. This program was produced by SECA, which is solely responsible for its content.